Hey everybody, welcome. When I first began making videos, probably, wow, some time ago now, here's some coyote scat. And you'll notice that this piece of scat here, this direction, right? That's north. That's been laid down. Obviously, right, if the coyote is walking along the path, right, and it's just gonna take a poop, yeah? The direction would be this way, yeah? Not this way. But this poop has been laid almost directly north. That angle is nearly directly north. And I was aware a long time ago that, long before there were any studies I was aware of anyway, that the bacteria in our bodies are electromagnetically sensitive, and they're particularly sensitive to gravitational fields. But also that electromagnetic interference, EMF, could cause them to become wildly disoriented, because it becomes very difficult to sense electromagnetic fields when you're bathed in 70 or 100 or 1,000 different frequencies of EMF noise, as most of us who live in cities are today. There are many little animals that are happy to see me, but they're going to have to wait until I'm done with my video for us to have some time together. And of course they're happy to see me because I bring them food in the winter when it's cold and food is harder to get. You know, not many things are producing seeds right now. So the little animals, the little birds and stuff, they're having a more difficult time getting fed. Also, there are fewer insects to feed on because it is cold and insects are under the, are either pupating or, still in egg form or something like this. Many years ago, so I have to thank my friend Ryan Firstdiver, who introduced me to the idea of phenological study. And I encourage you to look him up on Facebook and pay attention to some of his many videos. His library of videos is extensive and brilliant. And he's somebody who I consider an ally and a teacher. One of my teachers. Very sensitive, beautiful, and intelligent soul. Also quite courageous. When I first began making videos, and I think the very first one I made was a response to one of his videos that was called, Beware the Rectangles. Really good video. Again, I recommend it. And that got me started, and I had to learn. So look, when we are exposed to other humans through media or other means, direct personal contact, indirect social contact in public, we do what we did when we were infants. We emulate them. And this is part of why there's a new class of contagious psychological disorders that are being studied. I can't remember exactly the acronym. It's something like MOSM, but what it means is mass disorders originating from social media exposure. Now, I've been talking about these topics for more than 15 years, in depth. I joined Facebook not to participate with other human beings, but to study the toxic effects of something that I could tell immediately was going to be catastrophic for human intelligence, psychology, health, and well-being. Some children have made some biscuits. That doesn't mean that that's the only effect that social media has, but it's the primary one. Or it's an array of primary effects, more correctly, more accurately. Obviously, we also have access to forms of intelligence that we've never really had before. Here's a peculiar mushroom. So, it's not that there is only harm, but the continuum is mostly harmful. And it's harmful in new kinds of ways. These disorders that I was speaking of, again, I can't remember the acronym, it might be MOSM, but it probably is slightly different from that. There are a number of young women on TikTok, and this is a bizarrely punny problem in a way. Oh wow, this is an interesting construct by the children. Clearly it partakes of both hopscotch and the origin of life in the sun, right? At the top of the ladder is the sun. And what do we have? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. At the 6th level, we have the cross, right and left, the polarization. So that's 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and then the sun, right? Quite interesting. These young women, I realize I'm bird walking a lot here. And part of our intelligence, one of the most important aspects is thread memory. And this is something that's under attack by many of our current habits and what we're exposed to. It's something that we can develop if we work on it together, and we can practice it together. So I have to maintain my thread memory as I bird walk all over the place. And as I've had a cup of coffee, which is unusual for me, I may be a little bit more stimulated than I often am. A friend of mine sent me a TikTok video of okay, that's a Cooper's hawk chasing what looks like a red tail out of the local, out of its local terrain. I think they're Cooper's hawks. They could be red shoulders, but I'm pretty sure they're Coops. Some months ago, a friend of mine sent me a link to a TikTok video of an extremely attractive young woman who warned people that in the video she was about to make, she would be ticking. And what she meant was that she has a form of Tourette's syndrome. And the combination of her beauty, the sweetness of her personality, and her willingness to display what most people would consider to be a significant disability was extremely compelling. Now, her beauty is something that we would consider to be a subjective quality. However, it's difficult to imagine many people who would see her and think she is not exquisitely beautiful physically. But it's not just physically. There's an aesthetic beauty, And these standards certainly are peculiar to cultures. However, they are not merely peculiar to cultures. There are probably gene line components to what we personally or communally consider to be attractive, and we are also influenced by cultural exposure. In any case, the reason I bring this up is the video was so charming that for myself, I'm able to identify and resist certain kinds of risks most of the time, some of the time anyway. So I held back some of my emotional, my otherwise, what might be my otherwise natural and conditioned emotional response to this video. But my friend was saying, like, this is one of the most beautiful women I've ever seen, and I understood why he was saying that. And she was in the video. This is what's ironic, because the platform's called TikTok, literally TICTOK, and she was ticking in a Touretting sense in the video. And what has begun to occur, and this is very important because although the primary domain of diagnostic and clinical awareness is directed toward this particular phenomenon, we must imagine that all of us are learning to emulate things that we would otherwise never pick up by being exposed to them on social media. What has been happening is thousands of teenagers around the world, both male and female, although predominantly female apparently, if I recall the research correctly, have begun exhibiting symptoms associated with Touretting after viewing videos like this one. This means that children who don't, or teenagers or young adults, or even adults, who ordinarily would not exhibit any symptoms of Tourette's and who have never been diagnosed with something similar and don't exhibit similar behavior, after viewing these videos, show up in clinicians' contexts, in clinical contexts, demonstrating symptoms of Tourette's syndrome, meaning that they're beginning to tic. And that means uncontrolled verbal and physical spasms of sudden spasmodic or verbal just trying to think of the right word. You know, obviously it's verbal expression, but it's a particular form of expression. It's like spasmodic verbality, where they might repeat some specific word or suddenly emit a swear word, or repetitively emit a loud vocalization while they're attempting to form a sentence. And this is usually particularly catalyzed by emotional intensity, by felt emotional intensity. So that the more emotions, the more intense their emotional state, the more likely they are to have these kinds of verbal and physical spasms. So what we're actually seeing here is the onset of something that should alert us to a far broader phenomenon, an emulative contagion that's being catalyzed by our exposure to social media and certain particular forms of social media which we find unusually compelling. This opens the door to a wide range of terrifying problems, including various forms of psychological warfare that can be distributed instantly to millions of people with or without their knowledge or consent by parties known and unknown from any kind of institution, collective, cohort, opportunists, predators, etc. Now, this is an extremely disturbing phenomenon that we should pay very careful attention to, because it is a portent of the kinds of futures we must expect for our children, and in the near term for ourselves. But in the far term, we're looking at devastating dystopian developments that very few people will have the chance to acquire immunity or defenses or protection from. Now, this is not the topic that I began on, and I've birdwalked quite a bit so far. What I was about to say, what led me to this topic, the seed from which the side topic sprouted, was that when I first began making videos, let's backtrack a little bit before that. Before I first began making videos, it was quite uncommon for me to use filler words or filler noises, such as and the word like. I developed these habits from observing and relating with other people, particularly younger people younger than myself in their early 20s and so on, who were inclined by habit and also by peer exposure to use such filler words, and also older people who were using such filler words in order to fill the space while they were attempting to compose language extempore, meaning on the fly. Because older people can have more difficulty utilizing the seed elements that lead them to the words they intend to select for their meanings and articulations as they proceed through a verbal expression, they may become inclined to employ filler words so that they don't merely go silent as they're looking for the verbal clues that allow them to compose articulate speech. So when I first began to make videos, I had acquired some of these habits of using filler words like like. And in order to make coherent videos that I didn't feel ashamed of, I had to unlearn those habits. I had to resist the urge to use filler words and to consciously focus on not doing so. Something that I still have to do today. I acquired that habit from exposure. More recently, when I was doing some work occasionally for someone who grew up in Los Angeles, I noticed myself beginning to use words I had never used anything like before, and these words were particular to local culture and the film industry, and those for whom what we might call optics, which is one of the words, are important. So I found myself referring to friends as bro, a word I had never used before, and saying things like, that's not in my lane, think about the optics. And the optics means, how will people view from outside a behavior that from inside we do not necessarily notice the undesirable features of? So I began adopting, through emulation, aspects of what I would consider inarticulate street slang, mostly, though the idea of optics is fairly sophisticated. And I had to I had to practice unlearning those. And I still occasionally fall into the habit, depending on the group within which I'm communicating. Now, these topics that I've briefly skimmed over here are mostly unrelated, I think, to the primary topic that I'm excited to explore today. And part of the reason, the seed of these topics is related to my experience in making videos. And that experience is not so much that I am attempting to lecture didactically about things I know. Rather, what I am trying to do is explore feelings and urgencies and ideas that are simmering in my curiosity and passion for attempting to understand the big questions: what it means to be human, why we have minds, what's the difference between insight and delusion, brilliance and insanity, dreaming and waking, life and death. If we had clearer minds, what would leap out into obvious importance that is normally buried in trivial superficiality? Is it possible for me to maintain my capacity for articulate speech and thought as I age and am subject to the various threats and deprivations of getting older and being more isolated and being subjected to new forms of media, images, electronic objects and data, news and studies and so on? Can I maintain something of my edge or even continue to develop new forms of insight in the storm that I'm surrounded by and immersed in? And the answer is yes, but in order to do so, I have to exercise the faculties involved. And in attempting to make these videos, or in making them, this is part of my way of exercising these faculties, keeping them alive in a situation where I have few or no companions to quest with or for. To explore these matters directly together with. Mostly I'm on my own. I will either choose to continue or I will succumb to the failing input of nourishing, exciting, impassioning stimuli. And as that healthy stimuli gets replaced with toxic, predatory, and contagious, essentially diseases, I must struggle all the more courageously to maintain at least the baseline of my abilities, if not improve them. All of us will face similar challenges as we age. how we will respond depends on lots of different variables, and also our personal character, our habits, if we actively modify those habits or if we passively allow them to decline into essentially emulative decay, right? Because if we were to emulate what's going on around us, we're going to emulate the opposite primarily, not absolutely, but we're going to be emulating the opposite of developmental efflorescence, excellence, and practice. All right, that will conclude my introit, my prologue. Now I'm going to try to talk about the very exciting topic that I have in mind today. And I have this in mind because it's been part of my experience now for some time. Some time ago, I began to have problems in my dreaming. And I had a variety of different ideas about what might be causing these problems. I still do. I don't think there's a single primary cause. I think it's a constellation of causal factors, some of which have to do with age, others of which have to do with health and transformations in my social and relational experience. But my own situation isn't the interesting thing here, so I'm not going to pay a lot of attention to that. What essentially I discovered is that under certain conditions, there's a function, and I'm not sure if it's more or less associated with the waking mind or the dreaming mind. They both appear to have roles in it. If I had to hazard a guess, I would say this is a function of the waking mind. And this function is a way of sort of tapping the dreaming mind on the shoulder and letting it know, hey, it's time to give the vehicle back to the waking mind, which is dominant in a way that the dreaming mind is not. Now, these ideas of the waking mind and the dreaming mind are, I want to be very clear, these are vague approximations. Right? It's not as if there's specifically a dreaming mind and a waking mind distinct from each other. These are ways of speaking about processes that are complexly interwoven together. So I'm using this language conveniently so that I don't have to give long, complex introductory comments. And so, with that apology, I feel relatively safe continuing down this road, because it won't be as deceptive as if I'd not offered that. So, for the sake, again, of convenience, let's suppose that the waking mind has certain faculties that can, under some circumstances, intrude into the dreaming manifold. And I've discussed this in many videos. Again, both minds are involved, but certain common waking faculties of the waking mind are inhibited while dreaming. This is part of what allows us to dream. I think they are also inhibited in early childhood in a very similar way. This is what allows children to play and to imagine, for example, that the stick that they are holding is a ship or a dinosaur or a jet plane or whatever it is they're imagining. And I recall imagining things as a child, and it was a way of waking dreaming. And the adults were completely confused by it. And when they tried to participate, they had to pretend to participate. In other words, they had to emulate the child's behaviors without actually experiencing the passion, joy, creativity, and happiness that were the result of play in the children. And this is extremely important, this point. When we were children, the waking aspect of consciousness and awareness and the dreaming aspect had not yet differentiated. And what held sway was the dreaming aspect, not the logical, rational, waking aspect. And so when parents go to their children and say to them, "What were you thinking?" They have entirely the wrong idea. The children were not involved in rational thought. They were involved in play. And so when they took the computer apart and spread the pieces all over the room, it wasn't because they were trying to destroy the computer. It's because they were engaged in a kind of dreaming experience that was so profound and compelling that they literally left. It's like they achieved escape velocity from the gravity of logic, rationality, dreaming, and values that adults seem to think are really important. And they are important in some cases because, of course, if a child starts playing with an electrical socket, death can result, right? But they're not important to the child in many different ways, because even for the child, survival is not really the important thing, right? Especially in awareness. What's important in awareness for the child is immersion, intimacy, exploration, questing, adventure, wonder, awe, curiosity. These are all primary features of the dreaming mind. You know? I remember my friend's child, Zay, when he was very small, he would point at various things and say, big, big. It had nothing to do with the size of the things. It had to do with which things compelled his fascination. Right? And fascination, entrancement, these are features of the dreaming aspect of awareness. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we could learn how to retrieve these to our adult experience moment to moment at will? If we could learn to release the incredibly oppressive, constrictive, somewhat cruel inhibitions of the rational, logical, pragmatic aspect of consciousness that otherwise dominates completely our moment-to-moment experience, resulting in despair, loneliness, isolation, terror, fear, anger, rage, predation, rape, all of these things. Yes. Now, those are not the only features of waking consciousness. These are some of the features of waking consciousness under the pressure of the extreme deprivations that may arise when unbalanced by the constant intrusion and transformations that would otherwise be aspects of our ordinary moment-to-moment experience, particularly if we are artistically, creatively, or playfully inclined. So I began to notice in my dreaming at a certain point a particular problem, and the problem was that an adversary would appear. And I would become very angry with the adversary. This is an uncommon experience in dreaming. I almost never get angry. I mean, it's hard to make me angry in real life. So an adversary would appear, a conflict would ensue, and the more angry that I got, the happier the adversary became. If I tried to engage in physical combat with them, that would fail and also make the adversary happier. And for some time this puzzled me, and I had all kinds of speculations about it. But I came to understand a lot of different things about this. And one of the things I came to understand was that this is a rather functional thing. It has to do with dysregulation of the coherence or the synchronization, I just said desynchronization, the harmony between our circadian rhythms and what I call our Oneiric rhythms. When that gets dysregulated or desynchronizes, then one of the vocabulary loss moment here. One of the faculties that arbitrates this relationship sort of wakes up and becomes active. And I came to call that faculty the dream assassin. And essentially what it's trying to do is to end the dreaming cycle. And part of how it ends the dreaming cycle, it's not the only thing that happens, but it's an aspect that's important, is we get a little jolt of adrenaline. And classically, this is known to happen between 4 and 6 a.m. in the morning. Many people, some males primarily, and a few other people, probably some women, die of heart attacks at this time because that sudden jolt of adrenaline, if there's a problem with the heart or they have heart disease, that can be enough to trigger a heart attack. And this is part of why some people die in their sleep. One of the factors involved. Let's see what I can do here to deal with my shoe. All right. So, I came to call this faculty or this facet of the relationship between the dreaming and the waking mind, the dream assassin, because a player or situation shows up in the dream, and there are a number of them that I now notice over time. It wasn't always an adversary. One was getting on a jet plane, and immediately it becomes clear the plane is going to crash. Or another common one was an elevator would appear in the dream, and of course, we had to get into the elevator, me, and sometimes there were other people in there. Most of the time there were, not always. And the moment that I got into the elevator, something terrible would happen. The cable would break, and I'd be in free fall, or the elevator would be spinning, or some kind of terrible thing. And my dreaming mind became adept at resolving these crises over time, so that eventually we got into the elevator, the cable breaks, the women in the elevator are screaming as we fall. And I tell them, it's okay. This is fine. Nothing's going to happen. We've been through this before. It's okay. And so I wouldn't have to wake up. Right? But the goal of the introduction of the adrenaline or the crisis or the conflict is literally to collapse the dreaming manifold and flip the precedence of awareness back over into the waking mind. And I've had a long adventure with this quest to understand why at a certain point adversaries appeared, usually, obviously, in the last dream of the dreaming cycle of my sleep cycle. And what happened is I discovered this peculiar situation that I think is fascinating, is that I became able to overcome the adversaries in sometimes fabulous or mythically beautiful ways, like those you might encounter in a fairy tale or a fable or a fantasy novel. I found ways to gently overcome the adversary without hurting it. And some of those things were really beautiful and heartful and human. So it wasn't like I hated the adversary anymore. Now I could play with the adversary when it showed up. And this is a form of kindness. It's also a form of humility, because instead of prevailing, we play together and the adversary's urgency for violence dissolves. Yes? Now, I then began to theorize something, because I have a couple of friends, more than one anyway, who are schizophrenic, or they are uniquely minded in the way that in their waking consciousness, and sometimes in their dreaming minds too, there's an urgency to win, kill, and dominate the waking world. And sometimes not just win or kill or dominate, but to obliterate. And sometimes not just the world, but everything, the universe, the origin of the universe. To destroy even the destruction of the origin of the universe. Infinite, recursive devastation, right? And this is the urge that one might have if the dream assassin, so to speak, this is the toy word I'm giving to this faculty, if that thing if it overtook one's sense of self or ego, so that one becomes, rather than me or myself, one becomes and embodies and enacts the dream assassin in waking consciousness as what we might imagine, at least, as a pathology. Now, the self, whatever possibilities there are for the self, for a coherent human mind and identity, are dominated by a weapon. And over here, on the waking side of consciousness, that weapon finds itself to be in a situation of incredible impotence in nearly all of us. There are some exceptions. Extremely wealthy or popular people, for example, are not particularly impotent. And we can see a good example of the contrast, filler word, the contrast between impotence and the desire for universal dominance in our previous president, Donald Trump. Bizarre last name. We can see plenty of examples of this in various aspects of culture, but particularly in people who are psychotic, or sociopaths, or serial killers, or serial rapists, and so on. Although these aren't the only expressions of this property. There's all kinds of different expressions. Some of the most extreme of them result in problems like Hitler. There's that and other tyrannically minded humans who enact that tyranny day to day, consistently, in and on other beings. So we can imagine, or at least it's plausible, to reflect on the possibility that there's an analogy here that's useful to reflect upon and enlightening if we use it as an overlay in an attempt to understand certain kinds of behaviors. Now, of course, these behaviors can take on a variety of different behavioral frameworks or protocols. One of them is destroy all the other beings. And we can see this enacted in instances of mass killing, shootings, people driving their cars into crowds, and so on. In a sense, the dream assassin has dominated what would otherwise be the self, and the result of that domination is a proclamation like everyone must be killed. And I've heard schizophrenics emit this proclamation, but they're in conflict because their human self is still bound up and encompassed by the psychotic self, and the human self within them doesn't want to kill anybody, right? It's just this domineering, highly charged, urgent sense of impotence versus omnipotence, over, as the nominator, I think is the right word, over their humanity. And the problem is that the nominator, if that's the top of the fraction, or the numerator, is totally dominating for a moment the denominator. I may have that backwards, but I haven't practiced fractions in a while. In any case, what I mean is the upper component has dominated the lower component. And the lower component is actually the origin of the upper component, so that's a bad situation. All right, so this is one of the possible implementations where something resembling the dream assassin crosses over into waking consciousness, finds itself enraged by its impotence over here, or what's the right word? Furiously demanding universal recognition of its potency. Both, right? So that if we have someone who's rich or famous, or actually has some degree of power, is an influencer, is a CEO, is very wealthy, is used to having their whims constantly attended and fulfilled, and then there's a sudden disjunction where that doesn't happen, that person can go just volcanic, right? And we can see a similar principle in operation there. So this is the idea when the dream assassin-like quality crosses over into waking consciousness, dominates our humanity, and produces various more or less pathological states and behaviors. Now, all of these things I was aware of until I've been aware of over the past. I think I came up with the dream assassin idea, and my dreams immediately changed when I had this idea. I came up with it some months ago, more than 6, I think, maybe around 6. And I've been reflecting on it recently because I occasionally have dream encounters with this faculty. And I too have experienced, just as most of us have, anger in my waking life when I feel I've been wronged, I've been subject to extreme injustice, and I can't resolve it through any ordinary means. Then something that resembles this dream assassin-like thing arises in my anger and is willing, at least ideologically willing, imaginarily willing to engage in violence that if I enacted it, I would certainly regret later. So my human manages to negotiate with the rage or anger, the felt sense of impotence, the sense of self-importance, all of these senses that might otherwise, if not mediated, result in some kind of violence, even if it's only verbal violence, calling someone a name or something, right? Yelling at them. Being angry that I didn't get my way, or that I had to wait too long for something that I expected to be provided immediately, or in relatively short order. Injustice, right? So these ideas I've had for some time, and I've spoken about them at least in 1 or 2 other videos. But today, in part, because of a post by a friend of mine on Facebook, but also someone I've spoken with, Vidur Mishra, who I think of as a yogi in the sense that he is a practitioner of yogic disciplines, and someone who not merely seeks to put to death the mirage of the distinct self and identity, but someone who I believe has succeeded at this, even at a very young age. I think he's in his early 20s. And of course his success is not yet fully accomplished, but it's profoundly accomplished. And he spoke in a post recently which may have been copied from one of his teachers, Sadhguru, of the meaning of the word in Sanskrit, I think, certainly the Indian word samadhi, and also the word moksha. And these are words associated in common discussion in Buddhist traditions anyway, and yogic traditions, with enlightenment. And one thing I did not understand is that the word samadhi, I think one of the particles means intellect and the other one means equanimous, meaning intellect in equanimity. But in the discussion, this word samadhi was at first introduced as meaning something like died here or put to death, which I'd never understood about this word. I thought it meant an ecstatic experience of liberation. Of course, it appears to mean something like both things. So then today, as I was reflecting on all of these matters, it became clear to me that there might be another polarity of the dream assassin, and we might be very resistant to the onset of this because our ego wants to keep having the dream of the separate individual identity of Darren, and wants to believe and sustain the injustices and the accomplishments and the values and the losses and the pain and the joy and the hope and the dreams and all of the things associated with Darren. Oh, there was something I may have forgotten. I have to backtrack. So there are different implementations of the dream assassin's dominance in the waking world. One of them is kill everything outside of me, but the other is I will kill myself and thus destroy everything outside of me. And we see aspects of this in behaviors like cutting, bulimia, anorexia, suicide, other forms of self-harming, including various forms of addiction. I needed to highlight that binary polarity there between I will kill others in the world. In other words, I will bring the dream of the world to an end, right? Or I will bring the dream of the self to an end, and thus spitefully punish the others. Then they will know how important I was, kind of thing. And both of them are expressions of feelings that are very complex. It's not just potency or impotence. It's potency. It's like a fraction or an equation. It's potency. It's certain kinds of potency plus certain feelings of impotence equal the need to destroy, right? And these are mostly pathological, but they're involved in everything we do. They're involved in sex, in orgasm, in play, in work, in creativity, in art. All of these things are complexly enfolded together. It's not one or the other, this or that, the way that we commonly might think in language. All right, so when I began to think about samadhi, and this didn't occur to me till just this afternoon as I was intoning the Heart Sutra, and suddenly I became confused and forgot part of the sutra. As I was intoning and forgot, an insight leapt into my mind. And the insight was, what if there is a mode of the dream assassin whose sword kills not myself or the world or the universe, but the egoic dream? What if there's a mode of the dream assassin that brings to an end the complex manifold of the dream of the self and the world and time and linearity and cause and effect and benefit and harm and value and loss, profit and loss, richness and poverty, self and other, light and darkness, stillness and movement, up and down, left and right, in and out. What if there is a dream assassin who comes and just cuts through this so that the whole manifold just disappears, instantly gone? And this is a staggering possibility. Now, as a student of Zen meditation for some 30 plus years now, I think I've had things backwards almost all the time, even though I value my practice. And this is always implied. Rather than sitting toward the mind that does away with the self, it's easy to sit with the mind that values meditation in the wrong way, right? Or in, not the wrong way, in a confused way. And so when this occurred to me this afternoon, I was staggered. And I suddenly realized that something I'm terrified of is probably the non-experience but transformation that I've been seeking this whole time. And what I am truly terrified of, because whenever it has come, whenever my experience has come near to dissolving away the ego, immediately the intense fear of death arises for me. And so I retract and cling back to the tiny vehicle of the seemingly distinct self. Darren's life, his stories, his values, what he values, his ideas, his theories, his intellect, his music, his writing, all of these things, his house, his all of these things. So maybe I must learn to invite the assassin to come and cut off the root of all of this. Cut through it. Because there's nothing to lose except slavery to a strange kind of dreaming that has so dominated my waking life that the playful curiosity and adventure of the child has been mostly lost to me. The true freedom, true liberation have been occluded as if there was a permanent eclipse of the sun, the inner sun, that star of non-starness, that light of non-lightness, the dissolution of duality and plurality entirely into something we have no really good word for in English, because the word emptiness does not capture it. There's something more like perhaps pure undifferentiated potential, the before of differentiation. So I was very excited, and this is the problem, right? Once I have an idea, I get very excited about my idea, and now instead of being liberated, I'm further wound in the trap of intellect and conception, and I think, oh, this is really brilliant and all these things. My ego gets involved, it starts puffing up like a peacock, and then I make videos about it, which puffs it up more, and then I get attached to the video. It's just surely you can see the terrible trap that I am in. And if you have some recommendation about how I might be liberated from this trap, I would love to hear about that. Because it's some traps are too beautiful to ever leave them. And this is one of the terrible problems of living through a human lifespan. Many of the traps are dark and grim. But some of them are so entrancing that we will never depart them. And if we could depart them even for a moment, the liberation we would experience would be so profound that we might never return to them, and we could then be free, truly free. Free within ourselves, not without ourselves, although both kinds of freedom would accrue. So this is what I had hoped to share today. I feel confident that I have at least partly succeeded in encapsulating the insight in language. I don't know who will be able to make use of it. I'm not even sure I can make use of it, but it seems likely that I have a chance to. Now that I have seen this, I have leveled up, in a way, in my understanding of the nature of the dream assassin and the various manifestations that the processes and faculties I'm using those two words to point toward may be enacted in our lives, thought, and human situation, as well as our cultural situations. Very important to notice the cultural aspects of this, because in the cultures and societies, the urgency of let's destroy everything is the fundamental heartbeat of what human cultures and societies are doing and will continue to do unobstructed until they destroy everything, unless we can establish something else. And in order to have a chance to establish something else, we must first understand the origins and natures of the processes that have acquired our deep and urgent concern. Thank you for joining me. I feel so grateful to have had this opportunity to explore and share together some of the deeper flows and rivers and waters of the nature of our humanity. I hope we will learn together again very soon.